Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas now a few years ago, sometime in the 80s, which year I don't recollect, that upon attending a dinner party at Lord Stoughton's residence, I happened to enter into conversation with a most remarkable young lady, a Miss Rebecca Herzl, daughter of the merchant Isaac Herzl, both of them members in good standing of the tribe of Israel. This being the time before I was affianced to Marguerite, in other words, I then being unspoken for, Miss Rebecca, whose raven-haired locks of fine-spun silk and lithe figure could attract any man's deep admiration, as long as he wasn't a poofty, knew of my feelings for her, which were common among the male tribe. One tribe attracted to the other. In this instance, before dinner, Miss Herzl outlined to me her idea of establishing a nation for the Israelites in Palestine, their ancestral homeland. My, thinking her idea marvelously bold, but somewhat untested, wondered of its necessity, at least in England, given our increasing tolerance. Miss Herzl replied by pointing out the repeated acts of Jew hatred found throughout Europe's history, not uncommon either for we English, with Edward I famously expelling all Jews in 1290, they not being allowed to return until the Protectorate in 1665. In other words, she emphasized, tartly pointing her finger at me and even poking me with it at times, that the historical protections of the Magna Carta, an assumed English birthright, vanished for English Jews for close to 400 years. I, for my part, while conceding her point, attributed that great prior English anti-Semitism to Christianity, and more specifically, Catholicism, the Catholic-led and Pope-instigated crusades, especially having brought forth in England and other countries the murder, abuse, and robbery of Jews, and being a cause of Edward's expulsion edict. Thus, I argued that, given the present decline of Christianity and the rise of skepticism and even atheism, the political climate for Jews should improve even further. Miss Herzl's reply to me was that if all humans were as rational as I, she would grant my point, but that counting on human rationality in general was a dicey proposition indeed, and that having a nation-state for the Jews as insurance, as a refuge, if European anti-Semitism should reappear, was only practical. Myself, believing in having backups and backups of backups, was forced to agree. It never does. Let a woman have the last word. Now, if we turn to the issue of a home for the children of Israel in your own 20th and 21st centuries, we find today the highly readable and amply documented narrative of Israeli historian Efraim Karsh, with his Palestine Betrayed. A perfect introduction and more, he takes us on a detailed tour of the formation of the State of Israel, considering, among others, the very specific question of how the Palestinian refugee crisis originated and has languished. Karsh begins with a 1936 quote by one of the great Palestinian villains, the nationalist, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin Husseini, friend of Hitler and instigator of numerous pogroms, who said, "There is no place in Palestine for two races. The Jews left Palestine 2,000 years ago. Let them go to other parts of the world." Karsh contrasts this quote with the one by Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who said a year later, reflecting the view of many Zionists, "We do not wish and do not need to expel Arabs and take their place. All our aspiration is built on the assumption that there is enough room in the country for ourselves and the Arabs." Understandably, as a history, this book describes the various stages leading to the Israeli War of Independence and its aftermath. Let's break down our coverage into 3 periods. Number 1, pre-war. Number 2, the 1948 War of Independence, both civil and international. And 3, post-war. Number 1, the pre-war period highlights. A. In August 1897, the first Zionist Congress was held in the Swiss town of Basel under the chairmanship of Theodor Herzl, a young and dynamic Austro-Hungarian journalist, with a consequent immigration increasing the Jewish population of Palestine to about 100,000 by World War I. Many Arabs looked on with approval and sympathy for its many good effects. Number 1, the reduction of childhood mortality with the introduction of Jewish health services. Number 2, that no attacks on Arab villages occurred, contrary to what some of their leaders had told them would. Number 3, that Arab land sales to Jews resulted in handsome profits. Number 4, that agricultural productivity increased. And number 5, that many Arabs were employed in Jewish businesses, a typical example being the city of Jaffa, where between 1886 and 1913, general exports grew 6-fold, while the export of oranges, Jaffa's main source of revenue since the late 19th century, increased 15-fold. B. The region of Palestine never existed as a national entity or nation-state, being a province of other countries, such as the Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman empires. C. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour endorsed the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. D. The rise of the aforementioned Palestinian leader, Mohammed Amin Hussein, in Jerusalem in 1895, born, paralleled the frequently destructive nature of Arab leadership. By 1920, Amin played a major role in instigating an anti-Jewish pogrom in Jerusalem, in which 5 people were murdered and 211 wounded. He was subsequently sentenced by a British military court to 10 years in prison, but managed to flee the country and a few months later was pardoned. What's murder among friends? The Hajj was known for his nepotism and corruption, an example being when he forced Arab landowners to sell their land to his relatives at bargain basement prices, they turning around and selling the land to Jews for a handsome profit. And how did the Mufti repay his pardon? By the British? By, 9 years later, instigating a Jerusalem pogrom that killed 133. E. One of the key issues in the formation of Israel was naturally the size of the influx of Jewish immigrants coming from around the world, especially since some Jewish leaders like David Ben-Gurion saw the danger of the Nazi menace approaching. Anything, thus, which hindered that flow of immigrants to Palestine from the 1930s on, A, potentially endangered those Jews, and B, endangered the formation and size of the resulting state, a double negative. F. The British government often sided with the Muslim Arabs in their disagreements or confrontations, likely because desiring to make the region a colony. The British thought, too, that only establishing one state, not 2, was desirable. So oddly, it had to be an Arab state. Typical examples of British pro-Arab bias were, number 1, the support of various local Arab rulers in their bids to form countries, but not the Israelis in their bid to establish their own state. Number 2, in line with Arab desires, the attempt during one of the greatest historical persecutions of Jews from 1939 to 44 to limit the flow of immigrants to Palestine to a measly 75,000. Churchill rightly complained of Chamberlain's policy, looking directly into his eyes while addressing Parliament and saying, "How can he find it in his heart to strike them this mortal blow?" Not surprisingly as well, in 1939, Chaim Weizmann's plea for the admission of 20,000 Jewish children from Poland into Palestine as a life-saving measure was rejected by the Palestine Colonial Secretary, Malcolm MacDonald. Number 3. In addition, the British administration made it harder for Jews to subsequently purchase land in Palestine, restricting the purchasable area to only 5% of the total. Number 4, oddly, the British rejected the offer of 100,000 male Jewish fighters to fight against the Nazis in 1939, only finally allowing a smaller Jewish brigade group to form in 1944. Number 5. During the subsequent War of Independence, British forces actually strafed Jewish positions and threatened a naval bombardment at one point if the Jews didn't stop their offensive. Number 6. The U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem, Robert McAtee, in December 1947, said of the British, "Requests from Jews for authorization to organize their own protection against the Arabs are refused. By contrast, police arrests and searches among Jewish personnel in settlements are the order of the day." Karsh concludes that some of these actions offered a stark demonstration of the mindset of British officialdom, which was less interested in stopping genocide than in preventing any potential survivors from reaching Palestine. This was to scar Anglo-Israeli relations for years to come. G. As the 1930s progressed, the Hajj organized increased violence against Jewish towns and citizens. Although numerous Arabs disliked his tactics, they too suffered death or assassination when opposing him, mayors, activists, and politicians. As Karsh says, the number of Arabs murdered thus far surpassed that of Jewish and British victims, as did the acts of repression, extortion, and sheer plunder of the general Arab population by the Mufti. H. During this whole time, from the 1920s on, various Arab rulers schemed to grab as much of the region as possible for themselves. Number 1, Iraq's King Faisal. Number 2, his brother Abdullah in neighboring Syria. And number 3, Saudi ruler Ibn Saud. Number 2, let's now turn to the decisive second phase, the War of Independence, and its highlights. A. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 181, calling for the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states linked in an economic union with Jerusalem placed under an international regime. The next day, violence came to Palestine. B. What happened exactly on that next day? November 30th? Jewish revelers, buses, synagogues, shops, and pedestrians were attacked by roving bands of Palestinians with stones, guns, and bombs. The death toll of the next week was 37 Jews killed, and by year's end, 180. C. How did the British administrators respond? In one case, Golda Meirson sent the chief secretary of the Mandate government photographs showing a British police officer standing and smiling at the sight of a gang of Arabs ransacking and burning Jewish stores. In another, Jews who hurried to defend civilians were stopped and disarmed by the British police, and 16 of its members were arrested for illegal possession of weapons. Some of the confiscated arms were later found on killed and captured Arab rioters. Are those Marquis of Queensberry rules? D. In December, the mob violence escalated. Some Jewish neighborhoods being scattered and surrounded by Arab settlements and often occupying the lowlands were particularly vulnerable to attack. As Karsh says, all the Arabs had to do was block stretches of road running near their villages, then sit on the overlooking ridges and aim their shots at the trapped Jewish convoys. E. By January of 1948, the Arabs launched their largest offensive in the war yet, when some 1,000 fighters, commanded by Abdel Kader Husseini, the Mufti's favorite nephew and a prominent gang leader, attempted to storm the Etzion neighborhood block. 30 Israelis successfully repulsed the entire attack, killing 200 Arabs. F. Arab countries in the region started sending military supplies, monies, and new recruits to the Palestinians, swelling their ranks. G. Despite the fighting, many Jews and Arab civilians still believed that peace was achievable, with, for example, a Jerusalem Arab sheikh saying, "Without interference from outside Arab nations, there will be no trouble in Palestine." H. According to Karsh, the chief Jewish leader, David Ben-Gurion, instructed the Haganah, the main Jewish defense force, to exercise the greatest possible restraint so as to prevent violence from spiraling out of control, with the result that British observers reported that the Jews have kept themselves fairly well in hand, but if the Arabs continue their attacks, retaliation by the dissidents, probably the Haganah too, will be inevitable. I. By April 1948, given the Jewish loss of control of the road leading to Jerusalem, the situation looked increasingly grim. At this point, the Jews had suffered more than 900 fatalities and 1,858 wounded, compared with 967 and 1,911 Arab casualties. Jewish forces then went on the offensive as dictated by military necessity and recaptured the road leading to Jerusalem and the surrounding territory. J. Jewish victory upon victory followed, a particular case being their blowing up of the base of Arab leader Salameh, which demoralized Arab forces. Although usually considerate of civilians, in one case, that of the town Deir Yassin, over 100 civilians were killed by Jewish soldiers, with the Arabs responding by slaughtering 77 Jewish nurses and doctors en route to the hospital on Mount Scopus. K. As usually occurs in a clash of civilizations, when one side is vastly more civilized than the other, think Romans versus barbarians, Spanish versus Aztecs and Incas, and Desert Storm versus the Iraqis, the Jewish forces used their civilizational advantage as a force multiplier, in some cases killing vast numbers of Arabs while being outnumbered 3-1. L. Arab villagers at this point started evacuating their villages, sometimes due to hysterical reporting of Jewish soldiers raping or slaughtering civilians, or sometimes due to advice from their leaders or the British. Partly, too, their flight was caused by the inability of Palestinians to successfully engage the Israelis, partly by the failure of civic institutions to protect property, partly by the lawlessness, robbery, and mayhem brought by foreign fighters, and partly by the lack of food. M. Arab leadership no longer fought the exodus, but instead tried to arrange accommodations in other countries or find transportation, especially for their own leaders. As the British reported, the desertion of Arab leaders and the sight of so much cowardice in high places completely unnerved the inhabitants. N. In general, the Palestinian Arab leadership used numerous tactics to get the Arab civilians to leave. Scaremongering was a major weapon. Some Arab residents received written threats that unless they left town, they would be branded as traitors deserving of death. Others were told they could expect no mercy from the Jews. In Haifa, the British authorities said that while total evacuation is being urged on the Haifa Arabs from the higher Arab quarters, the townsfolk themselves are against it. But by May 1948, the majority of populations of Arab villages were in flight. O. On May 17th, 1948, the day of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, the Arab leaders of the surrounding countries, wanting to grab pieces of the region for themselves, decided to invade. P. After one truce, the Israelis incorporated new weapon systems they had recently acquired and proceeded to make more territorial gains everywhere, in Nazareth, Lydda, and the vital land corridor between Jerusalem and the coastal plain. This resulted in even more refugees leaving. Q. The only apparent significant instance of Israeli forces themselves forcing peaceful civilians who weren't fighting them to leave was during this crucial battle for Lydda, since there allowing the civilians to remain would have allowed for a potentially dangerous flank attack had those remaining civilians turned hostile. R. The Israelis, showing their military and civilizational superiority, again trounced the invading forces of Egypt, Transjordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, capturing over 50 villages and in the end 60% of the Arab part of the Mandate, while only losing one village themselves, a kibbutz near the border of Syria. S. As the war drew to a close, the issue of whether the refugees could be repatriated attained even greater significance. The Israeli position on repatriation was varied, but usually argued that those Palestinians who had fled partly could be assumed hostile and thus perhaps liable to resume hostilities. In addition, their withdrawal may have been intended to help invading Arab forces or their own fighting men by not being there. A third consideration was the pure demographic balance of the future Jewish state. Number 3. Finally, let's briefly turn to the aftermath in our historian's evaluation and discussion. A. Karsh argues that if the Arab national armies hadn't invaded, then the refugee problem would have consisted of a couple 100,000 refugees instead of 600,000, and also the Jewish willingness to repatriate them would have been greater. B. He points out that surrounding countries such as Syria and Lebanon refused male Palestinian refugees entry as well. C. When Jordan controlled the West Bank and Egypt the Gaza Strip, they might have created administrative states for the Palestinian refugees, but didn't. D. He notes that what significantly contributed to the mass flight was the contrast between the extreme exaggeration that occurred on the rare occasions when Jewish paramilitary forces committed atrocities in comparison to the more sober recounting of the Jewish side after Arab atrocities. This occurred, for example, in Haifa and Tiberias. E. He argues that the single greatest problem is the Palestinian and wider Arab refusal to countenance the existence of the State of Israel. This refusal starting with the Mufti of Jerusalem himself before the war, going to Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, to King Hussein of Jordan, and to PLO chairman Yasser Arafat in 2000, rejecting Prime Minister Ehud Barak's two-state answer. The wars in 1956, 67, and 73 were just further evidence. In conclusion, while I can only give this a provisional grade of A- given that I'm a beginner to Middle Eastern and Israeli history, Karsh's narrative is a perfect introduction for anyone wishing a comprehensive treatment of the period. It's filled with great detail and hundreds of quotes and happily free from the academic jargon so often found in modern works. Happy for my part to see my friend Rebecca Herzl's wish finally fulfilled, although unhappy in the irony that she was right to want a Jewish national insurance policy against anti-Semitism. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.